Welcome to these collaboration podcast episodes with Redline Racing. So, I've spoken to a lot of racing drivers to talk about their racing journeys and different races that they've participated in. But for this week, I plan on doing something different. This week, we go behind the scenes of motorsport racing to take a look at the technical and the mechanical aspects of setting up a car for a race weekend. This week, I'm joined by Guy McCulloch, who's the race engineer for Redline Racing, talking about his time in Formula Ford, Formula 4, and many other series that he's participated in. Make sure you hear this episode and you like and subscribe to my channel. Hi, Guy. Thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And yourself?
Oh, pretty well. This week has been pretty interesting for me because I've been a huge fan of motorsport racing. And this week was the time where I could find out more of what goes behind the scene. Earlier this week, I had Alex with me who was talking about team management. And this afternoon, I'm with the race engineer. So talk to me about your job. What is your job and what technical aspects are involved in it?
Yeah, so my kind of role, my responsibility is the performance of the race vehicle and the driver as a combination. So obviously try and get the most out of that package. So my role is kind of receiving information, so feedback from the driver, how the car feels out on the circuit, looking at data, analysing the data, looking at the car as well, looking at the tyres. It's very important to see how the tyres are wearing, what's happening with the tyres, and then making decisions on, if we need to make any adjustments on the car to go quicker, but also sit down with the driver to make sure they're driving the car in the best manner to get the performance from the car.
Right. So the way you've spoken about it, it feels like it's a very technical job that you have to perform. So talk to me about how did you get interested towards the technical aspect of motorsport racing?
Well, I've been involved in motorsport pretty much all of my life. I started off as an apprentice mechanic. Even before then, I was doing schoolboy motocross myself. But I started as an apprentice mechanic, and where I'd served my apprenticeship, there's a chap there called Peter Baldwin, who raced Minis, Metros, Rover Tomcats. He's a very successful driver.
And that was
I did my apprenticeship with him.
That was in what championship? What championship were you in when you did the apprenticeship?
But this is back in the 1980s, so quite a while ago. Okay. So Peter was racing in the Minis, Mini Challenge, Mini Metro Challenge as well, and also Special Saloons, which is basically it's a prototype racing car, so space frame with a race engine in it made to look like a road car. So if you look back in videos from like the 80s and the 70s, you've got these very powerful touring cars, which were special saloons at the time. They really were prototype racing cars, just made to look like road cars. So obviously I helped him on the mechanical side of things there. And just as my career progressed, I ended up, looking at how can we improve the car? What can we do to go faster? What can we change? What can we adjust? What can we redesign? So then I started to get involved in that side of things. And obviously between the 1980s and particularly modern day, there's been a lot of involvement with electronics. So getting involved in all the electronic aspect of it as well, and how we could use data logging to see what's happening on the car. So kind of progressed through that way myself, and then just getting to a point where, people were seeing what I was doing and wanted to take me on as a race engineer.
Yeah. When you talk about the 90s, tell me what time was easier as a race engineer? Was it the 90s that was a bit easier, or is it this time that you're working in?
The main thing that's changed really over that time is, say back in the 90s, a lot of the championships were far more open on what you could actually do on the car. So you could redesign the suspension system, you could, redesign the gear shift system, you could make serious modifications to the car.
Basically, the regulations were a bit lenient.
A lot more open. Nowadays, most make, so that means it's one type of car, and it's very heavily regulated on what you can actually do to the car. So most champions now is literally just adjustments you can make to things like anti-roll bars, ride heights, toe angles, camber angles. So you're a lot more restricted.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, back in the 90s, when the 2000s, a lot more freedom, probably what I did had a bigger effect on the performance of the vehicle. Kind of like I stated at the start there, now it's a lot more about me obviously trying to get the best out of the car with the adjustments that I can make, but then really making sure that the driver is driving it to the optimum way to get the best out of that particular race car.
Mm-hmm. And talk to me about this year and the season. And I think the first race, if I'm not wrong, is on the Sunday, right? It's the 9th of May.
It's actually Saturday's the first race at
Oh, yeah.
Thruxton,
Uh-huh.
and that's with the Caymans, the Cayman Sprint Challenge. Looks like it's going to be wet on Saturday, so that'll be interesting.
well, how do you actually manage the wet situation when you're racing? Because it's been so interesting to see that you have the tires that you need to take care of, the temperature, the brakes. How exciting is that? Like when the race is in the wets?
Oh, it's more about just making sure, because there's certain changes you make to the car, because obviously you're going to have less grip.
Yeah.
So change roll bars, ride heights, camber angles, and obviously, as you stated, put the wet tyres on. And you're always trying. And one of the real key things is trying to work out what the tyre pressure needs to be.
How does
and because
that?
obviously,
Uh-huh.
because I mean, a little bit of science, but obviously, you raise the temperature of a gas, and this time of year in the tyres, it changes its pressure, it raises its pressure. So it's trying to work out, I want the optimum hot pressure to be X. So what do I need to start with when it's cold to make sure we get there? And when it's wet, it's even trickier because the actual amount of grip you've got on the circuit is a little bit more unknown. So the more grip you have, the more heat you get in the tyre, the more the pressure will increase. So it's over the years, there's a bit of a science to it, and I've got lots of spreadsheets and lots of ways of working it all out. But car setup, one of the most important things is tyre pressures, making sure those tyre pressures are correct. So, for example, with the wets, if it's really wet, you come up a bit more on the tyre pressure because the channels in the tread, the more pressure you have, the more open up they'll be, so they'll disperse the water better. If it becomes, if it's less wet, then we bring the pressures down, so we get a slightly larger contact patch onto the surface to give us and be able to utilise that extra grip that is available because it's not quite as wet.
And I was watching this video earlier this interview, and there was again a video that was related to a race engineer, and he said that it's pretty that the most satisfying moment for him on a weekend is during the practice when the car is finally on the grid, and during the race when the first turn is done, because that's when the car is ready. What about you? What's the most satisfying moment that is there for you when I'd say basically your child is out there because you're putting so much effort in there?
I mean, obviously the whole idea is to go and win races. But in regard to myself, putting a car on pole position is just as rewarding as winning a race because there we are proving that we have the fastest car and driver package. Because qualifying is obviously all about just what's the quickest lap you can possibly set. In a race, obviously you want a really quick car, but there's so many outside factors. Somebody can obviously crash into your car, a puncture can happen.
Safety cars.
Safety cars, there's lots of other things which are going to influence the actual result. Whereas in qualifying, there's less things which can affect the result of qualifying. So,
right.
So probably love race wins, obviously. Also love getting pole positions.
Right. And when you're talking about the technical aspect and the journey that you've had from 2017 to 2020, you were also you were part of a different team, which was the JTR. So talk to me about that
Right?
experience. What was that like?
It actually goes back to 2018. I started with JTR.
Okay.
The 2017 to 2020 was with the Porsche Carrera Cup with them. So with JTR, we've done lots of different championships. So we've done Formula Ford, Formula 3, Formula Renault, Formula 4, and then on to Porsche Carrera Cup. I mean, one of the biggest things of working with JTR is there's a chap called Nick Tandy, who owns the team now. So Nick is a professional racing car driver. He's won Le Mans with Porsche in 2015. He's won all of the bigs, the Sebring 12-hour, Norsecliff 24-hour. So he's a very successful and very well-renowned racing car driver in the motorsport industry. So an absolute pleasure working with Nick. And it's also a great feeling that Nick wanted me to do the engineering for him as well. Because obviously Nick's going off and working very high-level professional with the Porsche factory team and stuff, but still decided that he wanted me to be the race engineer.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so with JTR over the time I was with them, we won 3 Formula 4 championships. One of those with Dan Camish is obviously driving with us in Porsches this year.
Yep.
And that particular the season, we won 25 races in a row, 24 of those with Dan. So that was a very successful season. And then obviously the link with Nick being a Porsche factory driver, the team decided to go down the Porsche Carrera Cup route because it kind of made sense. And we were competitive straight away. Obviously, motorsport is full of would have, should have, could haves. In the first season with Dino Samparelli, we actually finished the championship with the most points. But that particular season, that's when they first brought in a dropped round. So that means that your worst result throughout the season, you lose the points for it.
Wait, it means that if you perform bad in a race, your points would be lost.
What it basically means is you could afford to have a bad race. It's a bit of a daft rule. I don't totally agree with it myself. It used to be about a lot in the 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So to give you a good example, when Prost and Senna were racing together at McLaren, without the drop scores, Prost would have won the championship.
Right.
But after they applied the drop scores, Senna won the championship.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a little bit unfair. And back in I think it was the 80s, late 80s, Formula One kind of then changed their perspective and took away the drop scores. But there are quite a few championships that still have it. So I mean, basically that particular year, I mean, when you have a drop score, what it means is that Dino, who we were running, maybe should have won the championship. His worst race result was better than Charlie Eastwood's. So therefore he lost more points. Does that make sense? Man. So that then meant that the points became equal after the drop scores. So then they had to go and count back on who had the most wins. So then Charlie took the championship because he had more wins than Dino.
I didn't know.
But it's quite good to come into the championship and be that competitive straight away. The following season with JTR, we won the team's championship. We won over half the races that particular season. Then the following year after that, we won the overall championship with Dan Harper. 2019.
Was it? I think 2012. That was when Daniel had that accident. It was, I guess, in Spain. So you were a part of that team during that season?
No, I wasn't. That was a Ian team. Dan drove. It was prior to him. So with Daniel, I ran him in Formula Ford in 2010. First of all, for a season. He then went off and done Formula Renault. Had his accident where he broke his pelvis. Didn't race for the rest of that year.
Yep.
And after that, he came back and then came back to the Formula 4 Championship. It was called the EcoBoost Championship at the time. Yeah, and so that was 2013
Right.
when we won the championship with Dan. So his accident must have been 2012.
2012. Yeah. He came down to the podcast, I guess, a few weeks back. He was talking about this accident. And I want to ask you with this journey, what was that one accident that you may have seen that had a huge impact on like your mindset? It just made you think again of the sport.
Well, probably for me, it was at Snetterton. Again, with the Formula Fords.
That was what
being
year?
a safe, that would have been around about 2012, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But it'd been a safety car. So the safety car had gone out, backed the field up. So obviously we're on the pit wall. And at the time, Snetterton's got no catch fencing on it at all. So it's just literally the pit wall.
Mm-hmm.
No catch fencing, and anything that can fly off a car can obviously hit you. Anyway, the safety car came back in. The lead driver went to accelerate and then braked. So then there was a massive concertina effect between our two cars. One went up the back of the other, flew up in the air, and landed upside down on the barrier on the side at quite high impact. Behind that was obviously carnage, with lots of cars smashing into stationary cars on the circuit. Bits of car were flying over us in the pit lane because there's no catch fencing. So that kind of made me think twice about, number one, why catch fencing is so important. But also, it just, until you have a big accident, as a reminder, motorsport can be and is dangerous.
Definitely.
You know, thankfully, we've got lots of safety things put in place, and particularly compared if you go back to 70s and 80s and prior to that. But even with all the safety features we have now, you know, there still is the possibility of somebody becoming seriously injured.
Mm.
You do, again, you don't seem to see it so much now, but I've known lots of times at race weekends where wheels come off and it's bounced off into the crowd, and somebody in the crowd's become injured. You know, a wheel hitting you at speed is going to cause you serious injury, and I have known sometimes the spectators to be killed by that as well. So, you know, it's fast, it's exciting, but yes, it can be dangerous. So it's very much so. If we ever have a car come back in the pit lane during a race, we'll only send it back out again if it is safe to do so.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because we don't want to put anybody at risk.
Mm.
And that's very much where the mechanic's role comes in, to make sure that the cars are safe.
Right.
You know, that's why it's so much better for a professional race team to run cars than, you know, a lot of people do club racing and absolutely enjoy it and love it. But sometimes having your friends work on the car and they're not normally mechanics is not always the best
idea to do it. Mm.
Best idea, because, you know, things may get forgotten and we got serious safety implications. So
When you're talking about the racing accidents, the recent one that I can remember is the 2020 season that involved Roman in Bahrain Formula One. The
yes,
car when it just,
that was horrific. Yeah,
and
it's so
yeah.
rare to see a car catch on fire nowadays that quickly, because obviously the fuel tank was ruptured, the fuel cell. But again, go back to the 1970s, that happened all the time.
Yeah, and from that I remember Nicky Lauda's accident that happened where his entire car blew up, and it's just And when I'm talking about this, I want to ask you since you've worked in so many series, I've heard that Formula One is a very technical sport. So since you've worked in Formula Ford and Formula 2 and all the other races, talk to me, which one is the most technical one and which one demands the most attention for you as an engineer in developing the car?
it's a very bizarre kind of industry, really. So with a Formula Ford, for example, so if we go back to even like the 2000s, when we could do a lot more to the car, like I was talking about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
you're still trying to get that performance out of the vehicle, but it's only me trying to do it. So I'm trying to work out the best gear ratios for the car, the best setup suspension, the best suspension design, etc., and it's all down on me. And also from a mechanic's perspective, there'll be one mechanic looking after every single aspect of the car.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot more kind of maybe work intensive to a certain degree and responsibility. As you work your way up and you get to levels of Formula One, and obviously you can see there's lots of people working on the car in regards to the mechanics. So each mechanic has his own area of the car to look after rather than the whole car.
Right.
I mean, yes, it's a lot more complex.
But it's a divided work.
So, but the idea really is it's then, it's all, the team know that that person worked on that part of the car. So if there's ever a problem, they need to go to that person. And it's the same from an engineering perspective as well. So there's not one race engineer. There is a whole group of engineers. And, for me personally, I love the technology and everything that goes with Formula One, but I wouldn't be able to work in that environment where you kind of have to make decisions a bit more on committee. Where we're all going to sit down and we're all going to talk and discuss and argue a little bit to come up with what the best solution is. I much prefer to work in an environment where, well, I've got all this information. I think this is the path we need to take, so this is the path we're going to take. So for me, being a bit older, maybe, and not so friendly, maybe, I'd much rather not work in a committee basis and much rather, this is what we're doing, let's do it, let's hope it works.
Right. And as a race engineer, you're also involved in talking to the race drivers on track, right? When they are driving.
Yes. With the Carrera Cup, there is no car to pit radio though.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But there is in the Super Cup. So that's the Carrera Cups which go around and support the Formula One race weekends. And obviously in any GT racing I've done in the past before, there's also pit to car radios.
So if you've done, you have spoken to the drivers from the pit wall, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Oh yes, yeah.
I want to ask this.
I have.
When you are in a difficult situation, and I always think to me, how is that possible? You're in a difficult situation, the car is overtaking, maybe there's a technical problem or anything. But how is the race engineer always so calm when he's talking on the radio? I have never seen a race engineer shouting that, drive fast. How is that? How do you do that? What do you do?
You do have to have quite a calm kind of nature to start with, really.
Yeah, it's
if you
pretty
get
calm.
Overexcited.
It's like keep pushing. Like if I would be on that spot, I would be screaming, drive faster.
Yeah. But all he'd do then, unfortunately, is agitate the driver more, and then the driver would be potentially making more mistakes because he's getting agitated because you're getting a bit overexcited on the radio. So you need to be very, really calm and very factual, and only tell them what they need to know and make sure you're talking to them at the right point in the circuit. So normally you'll have a tracker so you can see where the car is on the circuit, and wait until he's on a straight. You start talking into a corner because he's just going to take his mind away and there's more likely to make a mistake. And also don't talk to them too much. They...
How's the car?
Only talk to them if it's something they really need to know, because again, you're just distracting them. So
right.
That's. I mean, a lot of people think being a quick racing car driver, it's just all talent and skill. It's very much a very mental game where you need really, really good focus. It's all about really being pinpoint with what you're doing with the car. And anything that takes your focus away will normally cost you lap time or a mistake. So it's making sure you're not going to factor that into the race result because you've been talking too much to them on the radio.
I always have this. I have this dream that someday when the race is going on, I think just for fun, you can give the radio to one of the most excited fan in the paddock. I want to see how would that be like. And
that would distract the driver very much.
probably that would be the time that the driver would be taking off the helmet, throwing it right at
Yes.
the fan.
They're probably coming back in the pits and asking what the hell's going on.
And with that, coming down to the final few questions of this podcast, and these questions are, I've asked this a lot of times, and these are like based on the history or the experience or a story that you that you could share. And as a race engineer, I know that there's so many moments, there's so much stress that's going on for you. But I want to ask you, if you had to pick one of the most nerve-wracking moment that has ever happened to you, what would that be? Tough one.
It's normally, well, I've had several nerve-wracking moments, but probably it's more to do really. One of the most nerve-wracking moments was, so I was at Brands Hatch, it's the end of the season. The race driver just finished in a position well enough to win the championship. But the other driver that was battling with the championship with him has then gone to the stewards to try and get him disqualified for something that happened on track.
What happened on the
So then obviously you've got quite a lot of stress and anxiety because, yeah, you finished in that position, you should have won the championship, but you don't now fully know you have until the stewards have looked at it. The stewards at the circuit looked at it, and then it went to the MSA Court of Appeal, because the other driver appealed the steward's decision. So it's not until like 2 months after the championship's actually finished that you actually know you won the championship.
What?
So, which we did, thankfully. So it's those kind of, a lot of the on-track stuff is quite stressful, but it's also a lot of the stuff, you know, the car goes into scrutineering. Is it going to pass scrutineering? The driver's put in a complaint against your driver. It's you know, it's a lot of stuff off the track as well as the stuff on the track, really.
And I'm right now imagining how would it be in the pit lane when you finish the race. Everyone would be like, "We won it." You need to be in this position for 2 months now.
Yeah.
And
yeah, it kind of takes a bit of the joy out of it.
Yeah, I mean, it does. And now finally coming down to the last question of this podcast. And I spoke about this when Daniel was on the show, and that was about, there's been so many races when the drivers are missing out on like 1 or 2 points that make a huge difference, like what you pointed out earlier with Senna. So I want to ask you that when there is a technical issue in the car and you may have to retire the car, how do you deal with that situation? What's going on in your mind? How's that like?
Obviously, it's quite frustrating. But the thing to remember, this is a team sport, and you win together and you lose together. I know the driver obviously gets all the accolades for winning the championship and what have you. But it's being a bit realistic as well. You know, the mechanical things, race vehicles, mechanical things can go wrong. And I mean, something I always found throughout my time in motorsport is, more back when I was being the race mechanic, check absolutely everything on the race car. Because that one thing which has never ever failed, you decide not to check that between sessions. The car goes out, and then the motorsport gods then act because you didn't check that particular thing, and it fails. So the race mechanics do absolutely a fantastic job in trying to make sure that the car is going to perform well by putting the setup, which I say, on the car, but also by just checking the car over absolutely amazingly thoroughly to make sure that nothing can go wrong with the car, which can be checked prior to.
Mm.
I mean, nowadays most problems are electronics based, which, an electronic system you don't know is going to fail or not until it does, unfortunately.
Mm.
So it is one of those things. It's a factor of motorsport. The championship is built up over a whole season, so that will include, driver making mistakes, things potentially breaking on the car, the driver getting taken out in an accident that's got nothing to do
Nothing
with
to do
him.
with you. Mm.
Yeah, so it's all part of of motorsport really, and it's just it's really frustrating. I've won championship. I've lost championships because of silly little things happening. It's just part of the game, unfortunately.
Right. And with that, I just got the title of our episode, Part of the Game.
Yes.
And with that, also, we come down to the end of this podcast. And thank you so much, Guy, for joining me for this episode. And I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
That's okay. Thanks a lot.
If you like this episode, please subscribe to my channel. You can also hear the audio version of this podcast. The links are in the bio. And I hope to see you again for this TheBonsPodShow.